Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our town hall. I'm Megan Irons, the reporter for the Boston Globe's Great Divide team, where we explore race, class, and opportunity in our schools. Today's discussion, titled The Digital Divide, Education, Race, and Virtual Learning. Our goal is to examine education inequalities through a racial lens, looking specifically at virtual learning in the wake of COVID-19. Today's discussion is supported by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, a philanthropic organization dedicated to advancing racial equity in public education. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our panel. But first, we'll hear from Ghislaine Ngunu, who is Vice President of Strategy and Programs at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. Ghislaine?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. So as educators, families, and students prepare for what learning will look like in the fall, we know that there are no easy decisions about how our young people continue their education. And as many have said, we are not only dealing with one pandemic, but two pandemics affecting our world and our public school system, COVID and systemic racism. We know that our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students who have already been disproportionately negatively affected by our historically under-resourced and deeply flawed education system are also the most at risk of suffering from COVID. The truth is that the reality of this double pandemic that has literally forced us to pause, to stop, to slow down, has applied a magnifying glass and made bare the deep inequities of public education, from persistent digital divides that prevent access to adequate technology, to the force feeding of old models of education that were not designed to facilitate the thriving of students of color, to the policing of how schooling and education should unfold, even during a time we are being compelled to think about how to decolonize time and curriculum, to the proposal of relief bills that communicate clear messages to our young people and communities, that we value economic profit and political loyalties over the health, safety, and well-being of our people. So many studies have been done recently and have raised some concerning, but quite frankly, not surprising data. We have about 30% of all public K-12 students living in households either without an internet connection or device adequate for distance learning at home. This number is higher than previously recorded. The digital divide affects every state and every type of community, but it is more pronounced, as you can imagine, in Black, Latinx, and Native American households, as well as in rural communities. And educators are not spared from this crisis when 300 to 400,000 K-12 teachers also live in households without adequate internet connectivity. No matter how the work of education gets implemented moving forward, we know that some version of virtual learning is here to stay, at least for a while. And one thing is clear, given who is most impacted, the crisis we are in requires a collectivist approach through a racialized lens. As we think about technology, curriculum, pedagogy, scheduling, how to engage families, social and emotional needs, staffing, community partnerships, resource allocation, and more. I am so happy to be joined by our brilliant panelists today, who will lead us through a discussion about virtual learning and school reopening through a racial equity lens. So I'm going to turn it back over to Megan to lead us through discussion and to introduce our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghislaine. I really appreciate all the things that you raised in your talk there. And now to our panel, let me introduce you. Vivian Santos Smith is a recent graduate at Somerville High School. Hey, hi, Vivian. Dr. Pedro Noguera, Dean of the Russier School of Education at the University of Southern California. Marielle Novas, Assistant Director of Partnerships and Engagement for Massachusetts at the Education Trust. She also convenes the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnerships, a statewide coalition of civil rights, social justice, and education advocates, and Frances Pina, a math teacher at Charleston High School in Boston. Just a reminder, this conversation is being taped, being recorded, and will be available afterwards. Welcome, panel. It's my understanding that some 1,400 people signed up for this event, so I'm thrilled to have all of you, and I hope most of you are here. More than 200 of you submitted questions in advance, and I will sprinkle some of them throughout this conversation. We'll also leave time for questions near the end, and if you'd like to pose a question, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started. Vivian, I'd like to start with you. As a recent graduate of Somerville High School, describe what your online learning experience was like, and did you think you and your peers struggled, and how were you able to deal with it?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, as you said, my name is Vivian. I just graduated Somerville High in May, and online learning, if I were to condense it to one word, it would just be tough, because it was really hard to stay motivated in like your house and not have that connection that a lot of kids like me rely on. For example, I'm part of Black Student Union at my high school, and we really depended on each other for that connection, for those discussions after school, like when racial injustice would happen at our school, because it did. We would talk to each other, we would vent. It was kind of a way to fortify these connections. But then having to be online, those connections got weaker and people were harder to contact. So I think this idea of like isolation and loneliness was really starting to get ingrained in our heads. And I know for students of color like me, I'm fortunate enough to have internet, but I know a lot of my friends don't. And a lot of my friends depend on school to have like this social connection where it's better than their home life. And that was taken away by COVID. So I think it was just a really hard experience. And there was a lot of issues, me being a public school student versus like a private school student, that were able to immediately get online and have classes, but we were like doing review after review after review, and it was inconsistent, and that just made it harder to be focused. So overall, it was just a very tough experience, and I hope that in the future it will get better, because there needs to be changes.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Noguera, I wonder if you could frame this issue for us. What is the digital divide in terms of racial inequality, and how wide has it gotten in the age of COVID? And what are some of the biggest ways in which Black and Latinx students, and particularly lower income Black and Latinx students, have been disadvantaged by online learning?
Thanks for the question, Megan. It's good to be with all of you today. So I think Ghislaine did a great job in laying out the problem in her opening remarks. We know that millions of kids were not able to participate in learning in the spring because they don't have internet at home, they don't have devices. There are millions of Americans who live in rural areas who don't have internet access, and that's true in cities as well. And it's ironic, today in Washington, the CEOs of Google and Twitter and Facebook and Amazon are testifying before Congress about whether or not they control a monopoly. It's ironic that these individuals have actually gotten richer during the pandemic, but they haven't invested in access to ensure that their customers can even access the internet. And it just is, I think, a reflection of our distorted priorities in the country. And so this is really becoming a crisis, because we know that there are many kids, the longer they're not engaged in learning, the farther and further they fall behind. And you think about small children who need support in reading, for example, this is going to have long-term consequences, or children with learning disabilities. So the implications, I think, are quite severe. It's also important to keep in mind that the digital divide follows other patterns, right? That is, we've been talking for many years about an achievement gap that between children of color, low-income children of color particularly, and their affluent white and Asian peers. What we haven't acknowledged is that the achievement gap is really an educational manifestation of inequality. Just like the digital divide is a manifestation of inequality. Health disparities are a manifestation of inequality. The fact that the so-called essential workers, who are many of our lowest paid workers, are more likely to contract the virus is a manifestation of our inequality. So the big issue we're not dealing with is inequality, particularly racial inequality. That's affected American education from the very beginning. And that, let us remind our listeners, is what the Brown decision in 1954 was designed to begin to address. And here we find ourselves over 65 years later with schools that are still segregated to a large degree across the country, but even worse, we have concentrated the neediest kids in under-resourced schools throughout America, and it's not an issue. It's not an issue we debate and discuss. In Massachusetts, where I once lived as well, we have the MCAS, which we require students to take, and we never, ever took the step to make sure that all kids were receiving an equal education, even though all kids, whether they live in affluent suburbs or Boston or Lawrence, are taking the same test. So there are huge problems that are not even on the policy agenda. My hope is that at least at the state level, I don't think we'll get help from the federal government, but from the state governments, we should see leadership to address these issues.
Thank you. Francis, you're in the classroom. You were in the classroom in the middle of COVID when schools had to shut down in March. You had to deal with the sort of scrambling to get kids their packets and students their information and get them on virtual learning. Take us into your classroom and talk to us about what you saw, what you experienced as a teacher with your students, particularly the students who are low income and Black and Latinx.
Yes. Well, I mean, at Charlestown High, when all this was first happening, I mean, it wasn't surprising that we was going to be gone in doing remote learning as long as we were told that we was going to be doing it. We were just really surprised at how late the decision was made. So I remember going into school that Friday on Friday the 13th, ironically, and like talking with some coworkers on like, will we be back on Monday? Will we not? The decision needs to be made now so we could be preparing students for doing the remote learning. So on the ground, it felt like we was doing a lot of reactionary decisions and not really being proactive. And I've been seeing that carry through even to today. So I know for me, when it first started, the focus was on thinking more through an equality lens, believing that would be fair. Like, okay, let's put all of our assignments online. Let's just get straight to academics. And it wasn't until we started looking at some of the data and how many students needed reliable internet, needed a hotspot, needed a Chromebook, and all these other things, along with like food insecurity, and also like some homelessness that some of our students in BPS experience as well, and families. So in trying to think activities that on the surface
okay. Francis, we're having okay. How many kids did you have in the spring, and how many needed Chromebooks? Francis, we have a little.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Go ahead now.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna switch rooms and okay, I would say a good. Yeah, I'll switch.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Marielle, in the meantime, as we get that sorted out, what do you think school districts should be doing, to prevent the widening of the achievement and opportunity gaps this coming school year? What have they done wrong, and what can they learn from moving into next year?
Thank you for the question, Megan. And I want to just say a few things before I get to that, to answering that particular question. I want everyone watching to know that I grew up in the city. I was born in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, and I came with my family when I was 5 years old. And I went through the Boston Public Schools for half my life, and then was lucky to do a program called Stepping Stone, which supported me in being able to get a scholarship to attend private school outside of Boston. I came back after college and I taught in the district. I taught at the Frederick Pilot Middle School in Dorchester on Columbia Road. So this is my home.
Mm.
And so my allegiance in all of this is to, first and foremost, to my family, to my people, and to my community. So as I'm going to answer not just this question, but have this conversation, I want everyone who is watching to know that I am not here for, I stand here and you stand there. I'm not here to, shade, as the youth say, anyone. But with that said, I'll answer that question by saying, I know that our school districts are doing everything they possibly can with what they got to serve our students and their families. No one goes into education because they want to do harm. However, what we need to grapple with is the fact that we have done harm. And so I actually lay a lot of this responsibility squarely at the feet of the mayor, Marty Walsh, of our city, and at the feet of our governor, Charlie Baker. How we have not moved hell and high water to ensure that our kids have an education during this time is beyond me. We are a heavily resourced state. We have Harvard and MIT and all these research institutions in our backyard. We pride ourselves in being number one. And we have generation after generation left these same families behind, as Dr. Nogueira pointed out. This is not new. And I know that in this particular space, I'm largely preaching to the choir, but it requires to be repeated, right? So when I think about our school districts, and again, I feel you all. I feel for our parents who are stuck. And as Dr. Nogueira said, right, largely in Black and Brown families, frontline workers, essential workers. Also, let's treat our essential workers with some respect and pay them like that, right? And so I feel for the parents. I feel for students like Vivian who, you just wrapped up your senior year, right? And you had to graduate, she mentioned earlier, under the rain or something crazy, right? And so I feel for the superintendent, right? I feel, there is so much pain to go around, and I want us to understand that binds us. And at the same time, we are horribly failing our families. And so what can districts be doing in this moment? There are really three things that I would point to that I think we are missing the ball on completely. The first is we need to do a hell of a lot more listening. And whoever just heard me say that and thought immediately like, but I'm listening, you're not listening closely enough. And I would invite you to question, who are you listening to? Because by and large, families from underserved, under-resourced communities are not being heard. Their opinions about how the spring went or how we're thinking about the resumption of schooling have not been taken into account. There is so much trauma in our communities right now. And if you hear my voice shaking, it's because the suffering that people have endured over the last several months, no es fácil, as we say in my house. It's not easy, right? Vivian spoke to, the sort of the compounding of things that happened in the spring, right? My sister was sick with COVID for 45 days. There was a day she ended up in the hospital when her oxygen levels dropped, that I did not know if I would see my sister again. Now, that is just one sister. And to be clear, she's still experiencing symptoms today. Extreme hair loss, anxiety, cannot sleep, sweats, paranoia, short-term memory loss. We're not talking about that. So when we talk about listening to families, it goes way beyond just anything cosmetic. You really have to sit with families' pains right now. You really have to figure out where they're at. Okay. The second thing that needs to happen, you absolutely we need to break the silo in how we're thinking about education. Education can happen and does happen outside of the brick and mortar school building. We have focused this conversation almost exclusively on the details and intricacies of 6 feet and 3 feet and in arrangements. And we have totally kind of forgotten that there's a whole community, there's a village around these schools that has always been there. We talk about kids who are missing. I bet you High Square Task Force might know where they are. I bet you Aspire or Teen Empowerment might know where they are, or IFC, right? How are we actually thinking beyond the classroom space to think about how we leverage all of what we have to provide our students with what they need? We can do this. but we have to break the paradigm of how we think about this. And then lastly, I really think we need to strengthen remote learning. We keep acting and talking as if, oh, we tried it and it's done, it didn't work. That's like, you know, I've only gone on one diet in my entire life, and I did it for a week and a half, and I was like, the diet didn't work. The diet didn't work because I didn't do it right. I didn't complete the diet. You know what I'm saying? So I think when we think about remote learning, when we think about instruction, we were so quick to kind of just default to the status quo rather than think about how can we actually think about this moment and provide a bolstered instructional experience through the remote learning, because we know that that's the foundation. Any version of any plan will include some aspect of remote. So those three things, I really hope that our districts are doing that in a way that really goes beyond what they've been doing already, because what we got right now is just not acceptable.
Thank you, Marielle. There's a question from the audience and that was submitted before earlier. Equitable access to robust internet still does not exist, okay? Many Boston students have had difficulty with connections, even when extra hotspots were distributed this spring. How do we make progress on this basic need? How would we go about making the internet a public utility? Any other ideas? I'll start with you, Francis, since you had a little technical issues earlier.
I know, right? I mean, this is what happens when you're in a household and multiple people are on Zoom.
It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it should, at this point, it should be a public good. I mean, the city of Boston provides like Wicked, I think it's called Wicked, Boston internet, like in a lot of public and green spaces. So I think we need to really be strategic and honest about the need for this as a public good. We can't really do the things that we need to do for remote learning if the kids don't have access. And how can we do that? Like, we have to think about how many people are in that household, how many students, how many adults are working from home and will need to access the internet at the same time. This also like comes into the political era of like net neutrality and thinking about, no, will it be paying for high lanes for these internet access? And that was a big issue with some of my families and students. A lot of them were using cell phone data and having to pick and choose, like, you know, do I put food on the table or do I pay the cell phone bill? Or I have this internet discount right now, but when is it going to be taken away? So it definitely needs to be provided. It definitely for free for students. It needs to be free for students, and then that's an extension to families as well while we're in this crisis, and it needs to be paid for.
Dr. Noguera, what do you think about this? You know, there were a lot of students who were accessing their schoolwork on their cell phone, and there are families that are sharing one, you know, where the children are sharing one computer. I've heard of students who've had to sort of go into a closet to get some quiet time because they're in a big household. So how do we get the utility companies, and how do we get around this issue? A lot of people talk about it, but how do we get around this issue? What do you think?
We need legislation, and my hope is that the hearings taking place in Washington right now, as we are holding our webinar, will be the start of that. That is that demanding accountability from these high-tech companies that have literally made billions of dollars during the pandemic, because as we know, many people are ordering their food online. So Jeff Bezos now is about to become a trillionaire because of the profits he's made, but none of those profits are being generated back into the society. We're not seeing it. How do we benefit? How do the American people benefit from the profits that are being made? And so access to the internet is just a step. Then there are the issues of where, you know, the devices themselves, the screens that kids need. Some kids are working off telephones, totally inadequate. So we have to make sure that the legislative process, that the political leaders have the courage, the vision, and the foresight to say this is something as basic as access to water, as basic as access to clean air. You have to have the internet, because in this age we're in, it is the entry point for information. And without it, you are left literally in the dark. So my hope is that our elected officials will see the importance of this and as a vital equity issue, and devise some creative solutions.
Vivian, you said that you had a computer and you had access to technology. How many of your friends did not, and how many of them were getting their schoolwork via cell phone?
I had many friends who did not. I was, as you said, I was lucky enough to have it, but it was really hard. And even with me, when I did have internet connection, it was hard to like catch up on the assignments and feel like you're actually there. Because a lot of the times, a lot of us felt like, are we even there? Did I even make it to the gate to enter there? So it's like, I think internet is so important, and I'm fortunate enough to have it, but I think, as Francis was saying, it has to be a public utility. It has to be a way that everybody can have access to it. Because in general, I think, even especially during this time, it is as basic as access to food, to water, to housing. And yeah, I know that some of my friends had to do cell phone, and if they had trouble with an assignment, some teachers would break them and be like, why are you taking so long? Or like, and there'd be like a lot of miscommunication on both sides. So yeah, it's a serious pressure.
Ariel, can you talk about, I mean, in the course of my reporting, I've talked to people who've said, especially when you're dealing with immigrant families, that their family parents who did not know how to turn on a computer, did not know how to access the information, particularly when they're dealing with, when they have younger children. So how do we support those parents? How can schools and educators support parents and support students who the basic language of technology might not be come easy in a lot of households as are others?
And I think the question you're asking, Megan, goes back to a lot of what Dr. Noguera mentioned earlier, in terms of when we talk about a digital divide. I mean, we can just replace that. Like, I almost see it as like, insert here, right? Like digital divide, racial divide, economic divide, right? Like it is all the same thing. So I genuinely don't think the question is sort of what do we do in regards to this particular thing. Really, it's, again, we have gotten this all wrong. Part of why we are finding ourselves in this moment that we are finding ourselves, where families and educators and our leaders at every level are having different conversations, is because there is no trust between those different groups. There has been trust that has been broken. And again, I will repeat this, for generations. So how can we possibly talk about, how can we support families now? We have to have a reckoning with the ways in which we have failed our communities forever. And I'm not being facetious, and I am not overstating, we have failed them forever. And part of what this moment should evoke in us is a sitting with that. Let's sit with that. We have never fulfilled the promise to our families. This is the home of Horace Mann and the promise of every child will learn. This is the home of the first public school in Boston Latin School, the first university in Harvard. This is the cradle of the abolitionist movement. And yet we have failed Black and brown families always when it comes to education. And I'll be fair, Megan, and say, there's a lot that Massachusetts and the city has done well during this time to ensure that meals are being delivered, for example. And so I want to recognize that and give that credit, but we cannot get stuck in the credit. The credit cannot paralyze us from criticizing and pointing out what is absolutely not enough. And so when we think about our undocumented families, for example, our immigrant families, well, of course, there might be a lot more happening in terms of those families not being able to access services and resources because there's no trust a lot of the time to really communicate with the school or the district to say, hey, I need help. Why would families think that they would receive that help now when it has never come? So we really got to sit with that in Boston, all over the country, but right now we're talking about Boston. Right, we really need to, and that is where I'm gonna keep repeating it until I'm blue in the face. We have got to truly listen to what families have endured And we have to not just listen for listening's sake and just nod. We really have to put them at the center of decision making and say, we cannot move forward until we have XYZ voices at the table.
So Francis, what do you think about that? And how do we begin to repair this trust? Just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I am here for what Dr. Novas just said, because it's so true. Like when I think about the sheer amount of like what's available in this city and the fact that we squandered an opportunity to take a community approach. Like some of the aspects of reopening has been about like, what about the childcare piece? How can we use community spaces? There's a lot of spaces that are available right now that we could be using. Unfortunately, there's a lot of businesses that are closed down, but has opened up spaces. And we haven't had that conversation because we are approaching this through such a capitalistic lens that has been reinforcing the inequities in the city, especially on a racial lens. There's no way we could integrate Boston Public Schools. There's not enough white students. And this population's even getting smaller because people are being priced out of Boston. So the future of Boston Public Schools is very interesting. So, and we're not having those type of real conversations because not only does it have socioeconomic pieces, but it has racial pieces. And this is the time right now where we can be having these conversations. If you would have told me that, Black Lives Matter and the movement with that would have taken over COVID, like over like the summer, I would have been completely surprised. But that's the space that we are in right now, to have that reckoning, to talk about what we need to do for not only for our students, but as a city that is heavily segregated and conditioned through redlining. And how can we really put things in place and put money where the policy needs to be to make it affordable housing, to be able to put this infrastructure in place and think about what is best for our cities and our neighborhoods. Because right now, our neighborhoods are hurting, families are hurting. And it's not just economic based, but it's also health based. And if we're not going to have those real conversations and talk about how to really support each other, you're not going to have that trust. And I feel like that's been something that I've seen a lot of teachers and myself doing and trying to reach out to students. And it's sad to think that probably the majority of teachers or educators reached out to families more during COVID than before because it was reactive. We are working in a system that is hardly proactive. And here was an opportunity to do it. And because there wasn't enough people at the table or feeling like there was trust, we, as teachers, we kind of waited on what would be the top-down decisions given to us. And it wasn't feeling like we was empowered or given enough leadership to be able to affect that change. And that's what we need to do now, especially in the city of Boston. There's too many resources, too many.
And Dr. Noguera, just to put a finer point on this one topic in terms of like, rebuilding trust. How do we move the needle here? I mean, there are a lot of complaints. We can list them all, but how do we move from just, from complaining to actually to real action?
So, several of the speakers have said already, Boston has more assets than most American cities. You have more universities and colleges in Boston than any other major city. That should mean that the resources to support schools are right there. What it takes is leadership. And I would say the mayor, superintendent need to work with local college presidents to get support to families that need it. I'm talking about now educational support in particular. And it goes beyond access to the internet. We have, to make sure that the quality of what kids are getting in terms of the learning experience is also rich and substantive. We didn't have time to prepare teachers when the pandemic began, but now we've had several months. Right. So we need to make sure that the learning experiences are rich and rewarding, because if they're not, kids will simply, even if they have access, not plug in. We've already heard, Maria was talking about the mental health issues that are there, which are very serious. We need to make sure that there are resources to address those. So I think that if the mayor of Boston were to make an appeal to the local colleges and universities for support and devise a plan to embrace the schools in Boston. Now, that doesn't address the other cities that also have needs, but Boston should be taken care of. There's no reason, because it's a city with, again, many resources.
Vivian, there's a question from the audience for you, which says, how can we give students personalized attention from teachers when considering the implementation of remote learning or hybrid learning? What can teachers do to better support you or students? I know you're out of high school now, so.
Yeah, no, I think the key word here is understanding, like understanding the situation we are in, and not, because as I mentioned before, I had a friend who like would get into, had a little bit of miscommunication with the teacher, and it was really like hostile. And I think stuff like that is not productive at all. It's going to make the situation worse. And we're already in a really bad situation. Like this hasn't happened for like a century. Last time this happened was like 1913. And we don't know how to do this. We didn't have a set of guidelines before, like, oh, this is how we approach a pandemic. And I think the same thing goes with like schools. I think that for teachers to make sure that there's consistent Zoom calls. I say consistent because the problem I had was that my school said, oh, on Tuesdays will be class 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, but that was the case. I think a lot of teachers didn't follow that. And I think that made me really confused. I was like, wait, why is it this day? It should have been that day. And I think making sure there's consistent Zoom schedules, making sure that it's not overloaded with work. Like there's just even like an icebreaker, maybe, honestly. I know it's very like elementary, especially for high school students to do icebreaker, but I think in this time it's good to just talk and make sure that kids are okay and make sure there's constant communication. Because if you break off that communication, students can go into a downward spiral. And we've already been in a downward spiral for like months, so we don't need to push ourselves deeper.
We're going to spend some time talking about reopening, but before we get to that, I want to ask Marielle, this is a question from the audience, who is tending to the moment when students log on and transcends into virtual educational world? In other words, how well are schools keeping track of Black and Latinx students who are being, who are not as connected, and to their teachers and their schools? Do you have any idea if how well schools are keeping track of our Black and brown kids?
The short answer is I don't know. I wish I was school-based or based in a district so that I could give with more confidence that answer. So I don't know, but I can share sort of what I have seen through my work with the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership, where I've been able to kind of get, a look into different communities across the state. And there are, the variance is great. Mm-hmm. It is wide. I mean, when we look at Worcester, for example, and I know the Boston Globe had a very important article that came out, I believe, a couple of weeks ago about the situation in Worcester, which is dire, right? Again, I don't want to throw numbers out there, but it was a very large percentage of students who did not log on or that the school was not able to communicate with. And so all I'll say, because I hate when you don't know the answer to a question and then you just keep talking. So all I will say is this, as a point of reiteration, that this is why having a community needs assessment is so critical, right? This is why you need to look outside of the school building, the school system, to see who else is doing this work in the community, right? Like we know, like the networks, having grown up in the hood, I grew up in Roxbury, I grew up in Jamaica Plain, like I always say this, the hood has a way of communicating. Yo, can you ask so-and-so, have you seen so-and-so's cousin? Like, have you, like this is how we find each other. These people aren't lost. They're lost to you because they don't trust you. And because there's a lot of pain that people are living. And frankly, it's not a priority, right? When your family's getting sick, when jobs are being lost, when the threat of eviction is looming over your head, when you don't know how you're gonna be able to pay rent. This is real. I have a WhatsApp thread with my family, and I'm constantly sending them, hey, they're doing food pickups on this corner, right? So this is real. And I genuinely do not think that the population at large really feels or understands the gravity of what a lot of families are being pushed to exist with in this moment. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a lot of folks who have not been able to communicate with their kids or have them see who's connecting. And that should encourage you even more to look outside of yourself.
I wonder what the rest of the panel thinks in terms of how well have these districts been keeping track of, of our, whether or not our Black and Latinx kids are logging on and getting the materials that they need in order to get them through this year and to start next year.
Yeah, I could speak on that a bit. I know something that we was able to do at my school was we was able to, like, because we work in a small learning community. So I'm on the 9th grade team. And next year, well, this fall, I'll be on the 10th grade team and hopefully get to loop with majority of my students. So because of working in the small communities, we were able to talk with each other, meet regularly, and like try to troubleshoot and coordinate. Like, do you have the most update contact information? Do you know where this person, like, do you have an address? What's that Google form that you did in the beginning of the year to get information? So we was able to troubleshoot together as a community. So we did a lot of that in-house. And that was effective for us to be able to contact families. But there isn't necessarily like a straight, like, district-wide central way to do that. And yes, we have a platform called Aspen, but most educators refer to it as aspirin because it gives you a headache and you need something because it isn't really effective. It is outdated and it's challenging for families to go in there and update their own information when they move, or it's a cell phone or even or email. And schools aren't doing a good enough job, like when students are coming into the district or transferring to schools, to make sure that it's updated. So a lot of that is happening on the teachers. So like teachers, schools on the school level need to be working in these pods, these small learning communities, and trusting each other and then sharing that information. So that way it really is that community feel, because there isn't a centralized way to do that right now.
You have some thoughts on that, Dr. Nagar?
Yeah, I go back to the fact that we've had time to prepare, and access is a critical issue, but it's just one issue. The other issues are the fact that we know the quality of what many kids got in the fall, the amount of time they got was just inadequate. We didn't give teachers enough training on how to do good digital learning. And the fact is that there are parents who've been homeschooling for a while, relying on it. So we have resources out there. It's not like, one of the things I'd recommend to the listeners, check out the Edutopia website. Edutopia has great resources for parents and teachers on how to do excellent digital learning that really addresses the challenges students face in learning a new material. It can work with different populations, and also ideas on how to address issues like stress and anxiety, depression, et cetera. So making those kinds of resources available to teachers and parents. And we haven't talked enough about parents here, because in many ways, during this period, parents have really had to step up. And if they haven't, their kids haven't been able to, their kids have been hurt even more. So providing parents with resources so that they can support their children at home is critical if we're going to see this period not become one of just utter further marginalization as we've seen so far.
Now, I want to switch. I wanted to touch on the reopening. You mentioned teachers haven't been given the ample time that they need to properly train. There are all these issues about access to technology and schoolwork. And I'm wondering, what are you most worried about in terms of the reopening plans that you've been hearing about? We've gotten some state guidelines, and this, the 3 feet apart, that always sticks out with me, because I've been inside schools where there are, never mind 3 feet, the students are literally sitting so close to each other. And the commissioner said there should be use of libraries and all the extra spaces. Many of our school buildings don't have any extra spaces. So I'm wondering what you think about these reopening plans and the impact that will have on our most vulnerable children.
Is that a question to me? Megan?
Yes, Go take it away.
I'll start and then I'll keep it brief though. My fear is that logistics is the only thing we're thinking about. And I want to acknowledge the logistics of reopening is very important. We need to make sure kids are safe. We need to make sure they're not transmitting viruses back to their families. But if that's all we think about, we're missing the larger issue of the quality of what kids get. Yes. And then we have to think creatively. Which kids should be prioritized? Younger children? Should we prioritize kids with special needs? What about homeless students? Think about homeless kids who are in living situations where they may not be able to do distance learning at all. So we need to give some thought to the kids who have experienced the greatest hardships and who have the greatest needs, and what we're going to do to ensure that what they get is better. We should not be trying to simply return to normal. We should try to move to an improved learning situation for more kids, and I would say for their teachers as well.
Nariel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I want to shout out my girl Elisa from Ed Navigator, Lisa Severnhouse, who said, "This cannot be the old normal with more hand sanitizer." She literally emailed me that yesterday. And I completely agree. I mean, what we're seeing through these plans, y'all, this is my teacher phase. Like, is this ain't it? Like, this is not it. I mean, again, some of these plans feel almost divorced from reality. Having taught in the classroom and having worked with students, I worked in a newcomer setting. So I had students coming in all the time, which is also something I don't understand how we're gonna account for, right? For children who come into the district throughout the year, if we're gonna have these pods that are not gonna ship. Like, there are so many questions around the logistics that I'm not really sure how we landed there. And likely, as Francis said, we need our teachers to be right there, kind of crossing the T's and dotting the I's and saying, that's not plausible in the classroom. And so to answer your question directly, Megan, I have had nightmares about the 3 feet thing. And I'm not kidding. Like, I have literally woken up from dreams where I just like I'm like, are we playing Russian roulette with Black and brown kids? Is that what we're doing right now? Are we saying that it's okay to say, well, the WHO, the World Health Organization, says that like 3 feet could be fine, And it's like, we're not gonna equivocate on safety. Do not come at families who have endured the kind of pain that my family has and tell us, hey, we're gonna do 3 feet in some schools just because. Like, that is not the solution, y'all. Right? And so I really would hope we still have time. Frankly, we have wasted too much time, but we still have time to really think about the plans that are on the table. There are some good aspects of the plan, right? And figure out where is sort of the plan not gonna meet reality? And like, how do we close that gap? Because if we show up to Teacher PD Week at the end of August or beginning of September, whenever we have the school year start, and what we have is these plans, is not going to turn out well.
But Francis, there's a question from the audience. Has it been communicated to you to address trauma in the first 2 weeks or so before getting back to academics? And I also want to throw something in, like, do you have a sense of how many of your kids are going to be returning to school? I think you teach 9th grade, right?
Yeah, 9th and 10th grade.
9th and 10th grade with these same problems, the digital divide. Are you afraid that might actually replicate itself? So there are 2 questions here. One about the trauma in terms of what have you been told in terms of, should you be addressing that in the first couple of weeks? And are you prepared for kids who might come back to school still ill-equipped to go to a hybrid model, if that's the case here in Boston?
Yeah, so I don't have a straight number of how many of my high school students will be coming back if we went hybrid. And I imagine that differs by age group and maybe even location in the city of Boston. So, but when I think about like the trauma piece, and knowing that, trauma is a natural response to environmental like elements. So So I try to think about it from an asset-based lens and a lot of resiliency that students are bringing in. So when it comes to, are we getting specific guidelines on, what you should be doing with those first 2 weeks? I haven't seen that, but what's becoming like something that's happening through discussions with other teachers has been, we need to spend those first 2 weeks building community. When we went to this stopgap of remote learning, it was an emergency. It was just, we need to get something in place, but we didn't really appreciate the impact of the community that we built in class didn't translate to remote. So we have to focus on that. So I feel like students and teachers are talking about that in pockets, because we're not all just spending the summer just relaxing at home. Like, a lot of us are doing professional development, looking, internalizing, our own privileges or lack of privileges and things like that to think about what we're doing with our students. So when we have these lenses that we're developing and reflecting on, and I'm speaking generally, not just myself as a Black male math teacher, but as a teacher who's even white, and thinking about, what is the approach that we're trying to bring into our schools in supporting and fostering like that we care and love for them and meeting with them in an equitable manner. Because one of the things that was a challenge with students even getting to access or feeling the motivational piece that Vivian was talking about, even with peer support, is, the state said, hey, no harm grading. And we was approaching it from an equal lens. So we was like, okay, well, I guess we should just be doing review. But what about the students that could access immediately? And like, we probably should have been teaching new material. So we need to think about it from an equity lens, and we're not having that discussion. So I feel with these 10 days that we are given now by the state, we'll probably be able to have some really good discussions about those first 2 weeks, about the trauma, about the ongoing training we need to have. It can't just be one and done, but we're going to come up with something that may be decent to good when we had an opportunity for greatness. And that's the thing that I feel is missing, and it needs to be ongoing, because we can't go back to a system that wasn't working. We need to continue to move forward and really think about other avenues and how to address these things. And I hope that we can get there and not just get hung up in the logistics. And sorry, that's a whole lot.
It's okay. We have a very short time left. And I just want, real quickly, if you can, Professor, are there places that are doing this well? Who can we learn from? Do you have a couple of quick ideas?
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, most of them are outside the United States. Toronto's done a great job at defunding the police very successfully. We could really learn from them. New Zealand has done an excellent job at reopening schools and managing the viruses. So there are examples we can learn from. And unfortunately, in the United States, we're again stuck on logistics. We're leaving districts on their own to figure this out. We haven't received clear guidelines, and it's easy to blame the federal government, and they deserve a lot of blame, but the states have not done a great job either at providing guidance to school districts, especially in the areas where we know the needs are greatest, like Worcester and Lynn, and we can go on. So I would say this is a time for leadership, and since there's no leadership in Washington, we have to step up locally and at the state level to ensure that this period is not one where we're going to see even more hardship than we've endured already.
Okay. Well, I wish we could go on and on and on. I want to thank each and every single one of you for the time you've given us and the thoughtfulness you've brought to this discussion. We had so many questions, and I was not able to get all of them, though I got quite a few in. Thank you to all of you who've been here today and joining us. I'm going to bring Ghislaine back for closing statements. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Ghislaine.
Thank you. I was trying to get my video going. You all couldn't see me. Thank you, Megan, but I was snapping and shouting here. So I just want to thank Vivian, Marielle, Francis, Pedro, and Megan for leading us in this important conversation today. I so appreciated the combination of heart, ideas, and actions, because this work and this reality is so deeply personal for all of us. You've all reminded us that what we do is a reflection of our priorities and values. Like, I'm left thinking, like, what does it say that some have gotten richer for example, these high-end tech companies, while families and communities have been suffering. Pedro, thank you for reminding us that the digital gap is indeed a manifestation of inequality, and that so many years after Brown, schools are still segregated, and that we are having long conversations about kids and young people just having the basics that they need to thrive. We can't gamble with the lives, the health, the safety, the well-being, and the future of our children and young people. And educators, we cannot knowingly remain complacent and complicit in maintaining this system and this status quo that further inflicts harms. It's not enough to tinker at the edges of what is needed to radically reimagine virtual learning and education at large through an anti-racist lens. I'm still thinking about this notion of curriculum, like what's really important and necessary at this time, what constitutes learning, who gets to define it, how do we honor the voices and needs of the young people who should be centered all the time. So to everyone listening and watching, as we continue these conversations about school reopening and virtual learning in the coming weeks, I hope we'll keep to heart and mind the important stories and the call to meaningful action that was shared here today. We must continue, as Marielle reminded us, and through listening to Vivian's voice, to center those most impacted, our families, our educators, and our young people, especially our Black, Brown, and Indigenous young people, whose voices, experiences, gifts, and talents need to be at the core of every decision made. And each of our panelists has brought this conversation full circle in reminding us that this is a moment that requires a collectivist approach. We need to reckon with the capitalistic, the racist, the individualistic lens that drives every aspect of the system. I was born in a place where it took a village, and it still takes a village to raise every child. So what we have to do, the work at hand, requires that government, educator leaders, unions, school boards, businesses, the tech industry, corporations, higher ed institutions, and everyone really reckons with what we have here and moves hell and high water. I'm going to use that phrase from Dr. Novas. This is the work of the long haul. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.